This is the Sony A7 IV. Now, I just recently got this camera. I pre-ordered it when it went live, and it was a nice little early Christmas gift because it shipped earlier than I thought it would. And I wanted to make a video to talk about some of the features that I really love about this camera, especially for me coming from using an A7 III. This camera, the wish list was really high to solve a lot of the issues that I had with the A7 III, and it's pretty much done all of that. And I think that this camera might be the best hybrid shooting camera for anyone who's doing photography and videography. So I want to talk about the features of this camera and what made it so appealing to me. And I want to talk about specifically who this camera is for, especially for anybody who is currently using a Sony A7 III. So without further ado, let's talk about my favorite feature of the Sony A7 IV, and that is the flip out screen. Now, this was without a doubt the biggest thing that I requested for this camera that I wanted to see on the A7 IV was this flip out screen. Having a flip out screen on your camera makes life so much better, especially if you're trying to film yourself for something like YouTube. Because if you're not able to see your screen, you don't know exactly what your settings are. You can kind of automate a few things with like auto ISO or maybe auto white balance or something like that. But if something goes wrong, you have no real way of telling if you're in the middle of recording. And so having that flip out screen is really a big lifesaver to let you know if maybe something's not correct in the middle of your filming, and then you can just go ahead and fix it. There are also some major improvements to the overall body style of the A7 IV. If you own an A7S III, or if you've used an A7S III, then this is going to feel very, very familiar. I think the grip might be slightly different, and I think it might be a slightly different finish, but the joystick on the back pretty much is the same. You have that top recording button on the top of the camera, which is nice. I also like too, on the top, they took the exposure compensation knob and they made it into a custom knob that you can assign to different things like white balance, which I tend to use quite a bit because I like to set my white balance. It's a nice thing to do in video mode, to just have that nice little dial to just go through the Kelvin temperatures, and then you can decide exactly what white balance you want to have without having to go into the menu system at all. Another thing that I love about the body of the A7 IV are these nice little port doors that aren't flappy and flimsy like the A7 III. These actually just fold out and have the ports hidden inside. We also have a full-size HDMI port, which is much appreciated. It's a lot more practical than using the micro HDMI and then having to convert it to regular HDMI like in some of their other cameras. Probably one of my favorite features of the A7 IV body is hidden, but it's much appreciated, and that is the shutter cover function. So when you turn off the A7 IV, you can activate the shutter to close, so that way it protects the sensor while the camera is off, while you're swapping lenses, while you're putting on body caps, or if you're just holding it inside of a YouTube video, you don't have to worry about putting anything on the camera to protect the sensor because the shutter is down. Now, as we dive into the features inside this camera, I've got to mention the nice mode selection dial on the top here. This mode selection dial allows you to separate your photo features, your video features, and your S&Q features all separately, so you can have individual settings for one, flip it over to another, and then you can have custom settings for that as well. This is really, really great, especially for someone who is a hybrid shooter. I know that while I was using the A7 III, if I wanted to shoot quick video and I had a picture profile built in, I would switch to video, have all that stuff set up, and then when I switched it back to photo, I still had my picture profile, I still had the same ISO, the same white balance settings, all of that. And it just made it a bit of a headache and a little wonky to have to go in and then reset things and then go take my photos. And then when I wanted to go back to video, I'd have to reset it all again back to what I wanted for my video settings. But that's no longer the case with the A7 IV, because you can just switch from one mode, have all your stuff set. You can have a completely different white balance, different aperture, ISO, shutter speed, anything like that. And then you can just flip it over to your video mode, and then you can have a nice S-Log3 picture profile, custom white balance, custom shutter speed, and then you can flip back and forth with ease. Now you just flick the switch, life's easy, it's all good. This camera is here for you. Now let's talk about the features inside this camera in regards to photography and videography. Now I'm not going to go through all the different types of modes and types of autofocus and pixel mapping and all that sort of more in-depth type of stuff. I just want to talk about the features that really make a difference for me and for my workflow and might affect you as well as a hybrid shooter. The A7 IV has a 33 megapixel sensor. This is a brand new Sony sensor, and I'd say it's a good upgrade from the 24 megapixel sensor of the A7 III, or honestly even more of the 24 megapixel sensor cameras that Sony already makes. Now for photography, that means you have larger file sizes, which is give and take. I like the fact that 33 megapixels gives me more of an opportunity to crop into an image. I'll often do that if I'm shooting landscape and I'd rather it be portrait, vertical for Instagram or different types of formats, then I like that I can crop into it without having to lose really much detail at all. And because it's a full frame sensor, you can even do an APS-C crop mode, which will punch in the image 1.5 times, and it will take it down from 33, I think, to about 14 or 15 megapixels, which is not spectacular, but if you were in a pinch and you just wanted to get a little further reach, maybe you're on a prime lens or whatever, then you can do that and you can still get a really decent looking image, even though you cropped into the sensor. Now, the only downside to a higher megapixel sensor is that if you're in extremely low light conditions and you're raising up your ISO quite a bit, then you may see a bit more grain in your image than what you might be used to from a camera with a lower megapixel count. I have definitely run into this already just in my short time that I've had this camera, but I feel like I'm just getting used to it and I'll find ways to work with that because I like the fact that I have more megapixels. I could talk about the autofocus and IAF and all that type of stuff, but you already know that it's good because it's a Sony camera and they do those things really great. So let's move on to the video features. First things first, 10-bit 422 color inside of the A7 IV, which is really a game changer, especially if you're coming from any of the A6000 cameras or the A7 III or any older generation cameras that were all 8-bit. 10-bit color is a joy to have if you're doing more intense color grading or if you're trying to do some more high-end professional work. This was something that was already included on the A7S III, but now they've made it standard on the A7 IV. Now, my last favorite feature of this camera is the big elephant in the room. It's the 4K 60p video. Again, that nice 10-bit 422 color is just fantastic. I know people are getting bent out of shape that the 4K 60 crops in by 1.5, and I would agree too that it is kind of ridiculous they didn't put the whole full frame option for 60 frames per second in this camera, but it doesn't really mess me up all that much for my personal workflow. In general, for A-roll, for talking heads, for establishing shots, I'll shoot 24 frames per second, which gives me the full frame on this camera. And for my B-roll shots, I would typically do something that's a little bit more punched in, mainly because I'm trying to capture little details, little moments, different things like that with my slow motion. So the fact that the A7 IV crops in by 1.5 times for the 4K 60 is really not a deal breaker for me. Now, if that 4K 60 crop is just a deal breaker for you, then I would just suggest go with the A7S III because that will give you all of the video capabilities that you could ever want in a camera. You'll just end up paying a bit more money and then you'll have less megapixels if you were trying to use it for a photo camera. And I think that that is a good segue to talk about ultimately who this camera is for. If you're a hybrid shooter, you're someone who needs high quality video, and high quality photos inside of one camera body, then I think that the A7 IV is a fantastic option, especially if you're already inside of the Sony ecosystem or if you have Sony lenses. And for me personally, it checks all the boxes on some things that I really wanted and desired from the A7 III that I've been using for a few years now. Now, if you are like me and you're using a Sony A7 III, you're wondering, is it worth upgrading to the A7 IV? Then that's a little bit of a different question. For photography, I still think that the A7 III is an extremely capable camera. Yes, you have less megapixels. Yes, the focusing may not be quite as snappy as the A7 IV, but I still get really fantastic results out of the A7 III, even though that camera is now a few years old and it's using a bit of older tech. Now, if you have a greater need for video, but you still need the really good photo, then I think that the upgrade is worth it, especially if you're coming from the A7 III, mainly because of that nice 10-bit color option. You do get 4K 60, even though it has the crop. You get the nice flip out screen so you can see what you're doing when you're filming yourself. All of those features are a major improvement if you're coming from a camera like the A7 III or even one of the smaller A6000 cameras. So for me, this upgrade was absolutely worth it. I'm loving this camera. I'm loving the capabilities of this camera, and it's saving me a lot of headaches. It's making my life a lot easier, and I love it. I think it's the best hybrid camera out there right now. But I'm curious to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments down below. What are your favorite features of the A7 IV? Maybe what are the downsides that I didn't mention in this video that you think I should know about? Or are there better cameras out there on the market? I'm sure there are. There's like a new one popping up every other month, but I'd be curious to know and to hear from you down in the comments below. And while you're down there in the comments, make sure to check out the links to the gear that I use, the text animations that I use, the music that I use to make these videos happen, as well as my Lightroom presets if you're interested in Lightroom presets. If you got value out of this video, make sure to add some value right back to it by hitting that like button. Really helps out the channel, as well as subscribing to this channel so that way you don't miss out on any new content that I post here on YouTube. And hey, until the next time, my name is SONY A7iv. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.